Hello and welcome. My name is Wendy and I'm your online church director. Wherever you may be watching us from, we are thrilled that you are joining us. If you happen to live close enough to attend our South Ogden campus, I invite you to join us on a Sunday morning at 9:30 or 11. If you don't live close enough to attend, I want to personally invite you over to whconline.com. This is where you will continue to get to watch the message live, join a chat room anonymously if you choose, but also learn more about online gatherings that may be happening or starting in your area. Stay tuned till the end of our message and I'll tell you more about what those look like. Again, we are so excited that you are joining us today. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the message.
Faith. What is it? Being sure of our hope, convinced of what we can't see. By faith, we understand the world was set in order at God's command. By faith, Abel offered God a greater sacrifice than Cain, and for his faith, God commended him as righteous. By faith, Noah trusted God and constructed an ark for the deliverance of his family. By faith, Abraham was willing to sacrifice Isaac, his only son, believing God would still fulfill his promises. By faith, Moses chose to be mistreated with the people of God, then enjoy sin's fleeting pleasure. By faith, God's chosen nation crossed the Red Sea on dry ground and praised him as it swallowed up the Egyptians. By faith, Rahab the prostitute escaped destruction because she welcomed the spies in peace. Time will fail me if I tell of Gideon, David, and the prophets. By faith, they administered justice, shut the mouths of lions, quenched raging fire. But others were imprisoned, murdered, and wandered in deserts, mountains, and openings in the earth. We are surrounded by this great cloud of witnesses. So get rid of every weight, of every sin, and run. Run with endurance the race set before us. Keep your eyes fixed on Jesus. He is the champion and guide of our faith. For promised joy, he endured the cross, thought nothing of its shame, and having risen again, has been handed his deserved glory at the right hand of the throne of God.
Well, I want to say welcome to everybody who's here as well. Thank you for joining us. Also want to say hi to our friends at the Weber County Jail who join us every Tuesday night, and we're thrilled that you are with us as well. We're in a series entitled His Story, and what we are doing is going cover to cover in the Bible. Why? Because one of the frequent questions is, when it comes to the Bible, is, man, there's a lot in here, and it seems like, it's just a bunch of random different stories. I don't know where I am in this, and how do I get a handle on it? How do I understand what God is trying to say through what He has revealed to us? And so we are going book by book all the way through from beginning to end, and not just making it academic, but we're also trying to take away some of the lessons that we can apply to our lives. When it comes to the Bible, there's nothing like it. 66 books written by over 40 authors over the span of 1,500 years on 3 different continents. And while there are many stories in the Bible, there is just one Bible story, and it is that thin red line of God's work to redeem and to restore and to bring people who matter so much to Him. And what we're doing, we're taking a lot of stuff and we're compressing it down into a real short amount of space and time. And a little bit of what we're doing to give you a picture of that, could you imagine, that's a hard one to imagine, but could you imagine that people had not seen the first Star Wars movie? And you had 30 seconds to tell them the story of the first Star Wars movie, and to make it a little bit more difficult, it was going to be acted out by bunnies. What would that look like? Well, believe it or not, there is a website that has taken that under and checked this out.
We're doomed.
Where are the plans?
I hid the plans in this R2 unit.
Luke, it's time to learn about the Force.
Chewie says you need a ride. This station is the ultimate power in the universe.
Wait, don't.
There's a disturbance in the Force.
Force, blah. I got a bad feeling about this.
Whoa, we meet again, Obi-Wan.
I ain't in this for your revolution.
Evacuate?
Use the Force. I have you now.
Yeehaw!
The Force will...
And there you have it. 30 seconds, and it's a little bit of what we're going to be doing here as we're taking a lot and compressing it down to a little bit. The goal is this, that as we engage and we pursue God in the Bible that He has given to us, that we know where we are in the story. And really, it's His story from cover to cover, from beginning to end. And let me tell you something, because we're going to look at some history books in the Old Testament. And not everybody is crazy about history, and if that's you, I just heard you groan internally. But let me tell you something about history that I think connects, some value to what it is that we're going to look at today. Because when it comes to the arena of faith, we might think that what faith is believing this wishful thinking, that hoping against hope, that there's some reality out there, maybe believing some ideas or a philosophy. But the God of the Bible tells us, no. That the faith that comes along with the God of the Bible is tied to events. It's things that actually happened in time and space, and that they are a matter of history. In fact, in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul goes so far as to say this, that if it isn't for one historical event, namely Jesus walking alive once He had been laid to rest in a tomb, and He comes out alive, he goes, you know what, we shouldn't even be here. We're just wasting our time. We should just be home, catching up on sleep and waiting for the Jazz to get into the playoffs, and all the other stuff that we would be doing aside from this. He says, if that did not happen, we got nothing. But it did, as a matter of historical record. So the faith that we can have in the Bible is a whole lot more than wishful thinking. It's something tied to a God who has made Himself known in this world of ours. It's not wishful thinking, but it is tied to things that have happened. So last week, we began by looking at creation in the beginning of the Bible, all the way till the Hebrew people were about to enter a promised land that God had given them, and that's where we're going to pick it up today. And the first of our books in history is called Joshua. And the theme of the book of Joshua goes something like this. It is possessing the promised land almost. God said, possess all of it. They possessed most of it and didn't complete the project that God had given to them. If there's a theme verse for Joshua, it goes something like this. Joshua is following Moses. Those are big shoes to fill. But God says, you know what? I was with him, and I'm going to be with you. Do not be afraid or discouraged, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. And did that make it smooth and easy? No. There was going to be some battles to fight, and there was going to be some territory to take. But you know what comes along with that story is an objection that I've heard a number of times over the years, and it goes something like this. Yeah, there are commands, and often they're referenced in the book of Joshua, where they're called and invited to, take people out. All of them. What's going on with that? And that seems like a really difficult concept about God to get around, because if He's taking them in that direction, what is up with that? A couple things that we need to understand. Because taking possession of that land is like a picture of divine judgment. And one of the things that we need to realize about God is that He is holy through and through. And holiness and unholiness cannot live in the same space. And so one day there will be judgment of all that is dark and wicked and opposed to God. But what God always does, no matter what you've heard, is that judgment is His last resort, not His first option. and that there is time and there is opportunity for people to turn in his direction, to turn away from what they have been doing. And for over 400 years in the land that they are about to possess, let me tell you a little bit about what's going on in the land of Canaan. It is dark. It is wicked. And we say that, well, what do you mean by that? There have actually been some recent discoveries close to an airport in Israel, and it was the people who were there in the land that was being occupied, and there are the remains of infant children that were burned alive to the god called Molech that was worshipped by the people there. There was a darkness, a wickedness in that land that's hard for us to imagine in our day. When you combine slavery, and slavery is bad in any form, and then you take sex and slavery and put it together and think of the worst place it can go, that was Canaan. And in so many different ways, God was patient, and there was time, and there was opportunity, but one day, divine judgment would come. There are written records of people bathing themselves in the blood of people that they had slaughtered, including children, and then participating in cultic rituals that are so dark, let's not even talk about them here. And so that picture of taking possession of that land is divine judgment. And what does that have to do with people like us? Well, here we are in our day, and we have time and we have opportunity from a God who is holy, who invites us to turn to him. And there's some darkness that lives inside of this heart of mine, and you probably know that's true about you as well. And you know what? There's a holy God who's inviting us to come and to turn to him and to follow him. But if that's a bit of a challenge to you, and boy, you think, man, that's a big thing to wrestle with, you're exactly right. But I think we got to just say it the way it is, and we got to factor that holiness and what that means into our picture of God. Well, after Joshua comes a book called Judges, and if we think about judges, they wear black robes and they have a gavel and they pronounce guilty and innocent, but don't think that, because what that word back then meant was political leader, activist, military leader as well, maybe a general or something like that. And the book of Judges, if it has a theme in it, it'd probably go something like this: who's in charge around here? Because for the most part, there was no official leader, and people were just doing, for the most part, what they thought was right. Here's kind of a verse that tells us that. It's not the only time this is said. In those days, Israel had no king. All the people did whatever seemed right in their own eyes. Can anybody see how anything would go wrong with that and how that might get off the rails? There's some dark stories in the book of Judges. And there's a theme that goes something like this: when life is great, God is an afterthought. But then, when our hearts get a little bit dark, God allows people to get handed over into the hands of their enemies. And that was an opportunity for them to turn back to God. They come to their senses. They cry out to God for deliverance. God raises up a judge who sets them free. And then once they're free, life is great. And then it starts all over again. And you see that pattern repeated over and over again in the book of Judges. And behind it, is this idea that, we might come to this conclusion that somehow, if we just follow our hearts, we're invited to follow God. And there are times maybe when God's direction and my direction are a little bit in conflict, and what happens in that moment is a huge time of decision. Who will I lean into? Who will I trust to be leading me in the good and right direction? And stories like that tell us, we got to lean into God. We got to follow him, even when it's hard and even when our hearts want to take us somewhere else. After that comes a book called Ruth. It's a really short, good book, only 4 chapters long. Ruth is from Moab, and maybe you've heard about Moab, this ancient red rock, slick rock mountain biking Mecca, that was there. Actually, Utah's Moab is named after that Moab in the Bible. But God was raising up a nation called Israel. And we looked at this last week. Why was he raising up a nation? Not just about that nation. He wanted to bless all the nations through that one nation. He wanted them to be a light to everybody else. And ultimately, he was going to bring somebody into this world who was going to change everything. Well, what often happens is when we're on the inside of that circle, we think it's really about us. And we don't often think about God's bigger picture. Well, Ruth is an outsider. And she finds her way into a relationship through some hardship. She winds up a widow, and then she makes her way to that nation called Israel. And it's not real open and not real friendly when she shows up, but thankfully, she gets in this relationship with a guy who winds up being her husband. She becomes the grandmother of a king that you may have heard of by the name of David. And we see that picture of what God has been doing all along. He is bringing people from everywhere who matter so much to him and inviting them into the story that he is accomplishing. And if you've ever thought about yourself as an outsider, that's not true from God's perspective. And this story, really, its theme is about love and faithfulness and commitment. And if you've ever felt like you were on the outside looking in, there's a story for you to tell you that that may be true in this world, but that's not who God is. And the story that he's been unfolding from the very beginning has been an invitation to everybody. After that comes 1st and 2nd Samuel. We're going to take those together because originally in the Hebrew language, they were written on one scroll. Well, how did we get 1st and 2nd? Well, when the Bible was translated many years later into the Greek language, Greek takes up more space to write than Hebrew, and so the standard length of scroll wasn't sufficient for the whole book, and so they put it on 2 scrolls, and that whole idea of the first scroll and the second scroll stuck, and so nowadays in our Bible we get 1st and 2nd Samuel, but they were written together. They're written from the perspective of the guy it's named after, Samuel, and it's written like a biography. It is a great read, and there are some of the great stories of the Bible. David and Goliath is found in there, and so many of the stories maybe that we grew up with or we've at least heard about. Samuel is the last of the judges, and he is the first of the prophets, and if this book has a theme, it is prophets and kings begin. Now, it's interesting, when God formed that nation called Israel, he said, I want to be your leader. I want to be your king. I want you to be different than the nations around you. But the people said, no, everybody else has a king. We want a king too. And so finally God relents and he allows them to choose a king, and they do. And his name is Saul. And Saul looks the part. He's head and shoulders above everybody else. You know, he looks like he could play tight end in the NFL. He just looks like he is got it all going on. But there's something dark inside of him. He is plagued by jealousy and insecurity and pride. And when a young guy named David comes on the scene, he's threatened by that, and he tries to take him out 5 different times. And he could have done so much and been so good, but he was plagued by his own demons, that darkness that lives inside of all of us in one way or another. And this is what God says to Samuel when he's turning in the direction away from Saul and toward David. Don't judge by his appearance or height, for I've rejected him. That's Saul. The Lord doesn't see things the way you see them. People judge by outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Right? God's got this different criteria than we do. We look at one thing or another and we draw all these assumptions and evaluations on them, but God sees things the way they really are. And that includes you and me. He knows us better than we know ourselves. And then God works through this guy named David. Now, if you know anything about David, David was far from perfect. I mean, David has an affair. David has somebody killed who is married to the woman that he had the affair with. It's just this sordid story. And yet, David is also given this title of the man after God's own heart. Well, how does that work? Because he wasn't perfect? No. But you know what he was? He was repentant. He was honest. When he stepped across those lines, you know what he did? He owned it. He confessed it. He repented of that. He brought it to God. He was honest with God, and eventually he was honest with other people. And you know what that means for people like us today? God is not looking for perfect people. And do you know why? Because there are none. There's just us. But you know what God is looking for? Is people who are honest, people who are repentant, people who are available, people who are teachable. And that's different. And a lot of times we think, well, you know, I'm far from perfect. I must be off limits to God. You just look at the story of David and realize God can use us, and God wants to work in us to transform us and to make us over. Next comes the book of Kings and Chronicles, and we're going to take those together because they look at the same 400-year span just from different perspectives. And what happens during this time is not a bright spot in the history of the nation of Israel, because Israel splits into two, into a northern and a southern kingdom. There was Saul, followed by David's son named Solomon. He started out great. He ended very poorly. And after him came a long succession of kings. Few of them were close to God. Many of them were far from God, and they led the nation away from God. And during that time, it divides up in these two nations and eventually leads them into captivity. To give you a picture of that, the northern kingdom kept the name Israel, and that was 10 tribes together, and they were invaded and taken into slavery in the year 722 BC by the nation of Assyria. They never came back from captivity. In the year 586 BC, the southern part, which took the name Judah, was invaded by the nation of Babylon, and they were gone for 70 years, and then through God's work, they were allowed to come back. But we see a time in the history of the nation of Israel where they are divided into two, and then they are led away in captivity. When those books begin, you see the beginning of the kings. When the books end, you see foreign kings who are in charge, who have just conquered the nation. When those books begin, you see a temple being constructed. When the books end, you see the temple being destroyed by those invaded armies. And so you see this up and down roller coaster ride through history. And while there are many stories, there is just one story of the Bible. Because after that comes Ezra and Nehemiah. We're going to take those together, and what they have to do with is return from captivity. And it is about restoration and renewal, and how God works even through the heart of a pagan king who doesn't acknowledge the God of the Bible, but he stirred the heart of Cyrus to put this proclamation in writing and to send it throughout his kingdom. And basically, you can return to the land from which you came. And so when they went back, they began to reconstruct that temple, and they began to reestablish themselves as a nation. During that time, as well as in the last of our historical books called Esther, and it's named after the hero of that story, and it's a brave woman named Esther who is in captivity, learns about a plot to wipe out the Jewish people, to bring about this genocide. And she steps into a place where she puts her life on the line in front of the king who couldn't, have to answer to anybody. And she winds up helping those people survive. Interesting thing about the book of Esther, God is never mentioned once. And yet he's at work the entire time. And as God often works, it is behind the scenes. And if sometimes we wonder, well, where is God in the middle of things that are coming at us that are awfully difficult? You know what? He is there. And he is at work, often unseen. But he is the God who is sovereign and who is over the events of history. One area of special focus that I think we really need to zero in on is the temple in this nation called Israel. It would be difficult for us to overestimate how important it was. It was the centerpiece of worship in the nation of Israel. And maybe today you think, well, why isn't that we don't have temples, and why don't we have priests, and why don't we have all the sacrifices and everything that took place, back then? Why is it so different today? Well, let's go back in time a little bit. When the nation was still wandering through the wilderness, God gave instructions to Moses, the leader at the time, to build what was called the Tabernacle, and that's what it looked like. It's one rendering of it. It was made to be portable. It could be taken down and put up, and when you're a nation on the move, you got to bring it with you. And that's what it looked like on the outside, and if you wonder what's on the inside there, here's sort of an overview of it. And only the priests were allowed into the holy place. And then if you notice, there's a curtain there. And behind that curtain is what was called the Holy of Holies. And what's in the Holy of Holies? The Ark of the Covenant. And what's the Ark of the Covenant? It's that thing when you lift the lid off, somebody's face gets melted off, right? Because we all saw it in Raiders of the Lost Ark. Well, that's not real, but the Ark of the Covenant is real. And it was in that place. And to get beyond that curtain, only one priest, the high priest, one time every year could go with a sacrifice to make on behalf of the people. And there was seriousness about that place, and you just didn't wander in there. In fact, History tells us that when the high priest went in there, they tied a rope around his leg because if he keeled over in there, ain't nobody going in to get him out. We'll just pull him out through the curtain. You don't mess with that. It is serious, serious business. So that's the tabernacle when they're on the move. Well, when they become a nation, a kingdom, they actually build a temple. And this was the temple that Solomon built. And inside of that structure that you see there, the same idea of the holy place, there was the curtain, and then there's the Holy of Holies, and you don't dabble with that. It is very serious business. Well, this is the temple that was destroyed in 586 BC by the Babylonian army as they came down and they just leveled the entire thing. When the people come back from captivity, they want to rebuild the temple, but they rebuild a smaller version of it. They live with that for a couple hundred years. And then there's a ruler in place in this region of the world. His name is Herod, and Herod decides that he's going to rebuild and expand the temple, and it is larger than it has ever been. That's what the temple would have looked like when Jesus was here in this world. And we say, well, what happened to that temple? That one was destroyed by the Roman army in 70 AD. And as they came down, they leveled it and didn't leave one stone on top of another. And maybe you know that all we have left of that in this day is called the Western Wall. And that was really a retaining wall as that temple was expanded. It's the only thing left standing from that. It's an extremely holy site in Israel. And maybe you've seen people go there to pray and they write out prayers and they stick them between some of the stones where there are spaces. You say, well, why do we talk about all of that? Because when Jesus was here in this world, there is something that relates to the temple that we must understand. It's so vital to what God has been doing right from the beginning. The temple was all about creating a place where you could go to meet with God and things could be done on your behalf for God. But then something changes when Jesus is here in this world. He lives the life that none of us could ever live, a life without sin. And then on purpose, he allows his life to be taken from him as he is nailed to a Roman cross to die. And when he dies on that cross, the New Testament tells us that some interesting things happen. The light from the sun was gone, and suddenly the curtain in the sanctuary of the temple was torn down the middle. Not just a random detail, but something that would have communicated to people who had lived with that idea of that place being closed off for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Jesus comes to make payment for my sins and yours. And what happens in that moment? Access to God is granted, not by what anyone has done except for Jesus. And the barrier that kept us from having direct access to a holy God has now been taken away by the only one who could do it. And in the moment when Jesus made that sacrifice, the veil was torn and people like us could have access to a holy God, the God of heaven. You know what? It's always been about Jesus, all along. And even that picture of everything that happened there, everything that happened before Jesus came was pointing in that direction. One day he's coming. And everything you see in the Bible afterwards points back that Jesus says, in light of what he has done, here's how we are called to live and who we're called to be. It's always been about Jesus. What did it accomplish? Here's the way that the writer of the Hebrews says in the New Testament. And so, dear brothers and sisters, we can boldly enter heaven's most holy place, the Holy of Holies. Why? Because of us. Because of the blood of Jesus. By his death, Jesus opened a new and life-giving way through the curtain into the most holy place. And since we have a great high priest who rules over God's house, let us go right into the presence of God with sincere hearts, fully trusting him. For our guilty consciences have been sprinkled with Christ's blood to make us clean, and our bodies have been washed with pure water. Jesus changed everything. And now we can go directly to him. And all those things that were put in place there were indicators meant to point us in the direction of the one who would come to finally and fully fulfill all that had been promised for so long. And on the other side of that, people like us can go directly to God. Let me give you a couple takeaways here as we wind this down just a bit. And we've already said this. It's already been about Jesus. And really, truly, it is. And when it comes to the arena of faith, many times what we do is we get involved in interesting, secondary, debatable kind of things. And those might be fun and have a time and a place. But at the center of faith in the God of the Bible is all that Jesus came to do and what he accomplished for us. Another takeaway with God, if it has not ended in joy, it has not ended. And you might find yourself right now in the middle of a difficult time. If you look back in history with this nation that God was building, there were times when it was great, there were times when it was hard. And if you find yourself in one of those hard times, in one of those dark times, the promise that God has made in a relationship with him is that in this world sometimes we will have trouble. But take heart, he has overcome the world. And there's a promise that it will end with joy. And so if you're not there yet, but you're in a relationship with God, it's not done yet. And so continue to journey with him. Do not lose hope. Do not lose faith. Do not lose confidence in the God who is sovereign over the events of this world, which sometimes are hard to understand, sometimes seem so opposed to anything to do with God. He is still at work, and with him it will end with joy. And one final takeaway. You can trust an uncertain future, an unknown future, to a known God. Do you know what this afternoon holds for you? Do you know what tomorrow holds for you? Do you know what next year holds for you? And none of us can answer that with any confidence, but God knows. He holds the future. He is sovereign over the events that play out in this world. And we don't need to live with that day-by-day, moment-by-moment anxiety of the things over which we have no control. There is a God who does. And he has invited people to trust him, to come to him, to be in a relationship with him. And the future may seem uncertain in all kinds of different ways in this world, but God will bring it ultimately to a conclusion of his choosing, and it will be good. And so in this world, there's a lot of things that we just simply don't know. But there is a God we can know. And there is a God that we can trust. And there is a God with whom we can journey. Have you stepped into that relationship with him? Because it's not automatic. That thin red line of God's redemption in this world is the same today as it always has been. That God is seeking to communicate his love, his gracious acceptance of people who deserve none of his goodness, and yet he gives it so freely. But it calls us to come to him, to surrender to him, to follow him, and to walk with him. I'm going to invite you to bow your heads together with me. And could it be that for the first time, you just need to step across that line of faith and take that step into a relationship with God? It is acknowledging the truth about who we are, and we're all in the same boat with that. We've all missed God's holy mark, that perfect mark. And it's God coming to our rescue, doing for us what we could never do for ourselves. And so we can trust him, we can put our hope in him, and not just wishful thinking, but confidence in the God who has been at work since the beginning of this world to show us his great love for us and draw us to him. And Lord Jesus, I'm thankful that anytime, anywhere, we can take that step of faith. There's no magic words. There's no hoops through which we have to jump. We just need to come to you. We need to receive the gift of your grace, your forgiveness. And we are given a relationship with you. And thank you for taking the first step in our direction. Thank you for accomplishing every step on our behalf. And God, may we draw close to you. May we journey together with you. And thank you for the goodness and grace you give us along the way. And we ask and pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Really hope you guys took something away from the message today. Visit us next week here at the South Ogden campus or at whconline.com, where you can learn more about online gatherings. What's an online gathering? Maybe right now you're watching from home. Maybe next week invite some friends to join you, or go to a coffee shop and invite some friends to come along and watch the message with you. We believe that location is not a limitation to your church community. By visiting us at whconline.com, clicking Join an Online Gathering, I will be in touch and we can talk more about what it looks like to join an online gathering or start your own online gathering. Thanks so much for joining us, everyone. Hope you have a great week.